In this tutorial, I will show you how to knit a hat using the tiny heart stitch technique. For this tutorial, you will need a round loom of any size, yarn, I recommend DK or Sport, a hook, and scissors. To begin, we're going to go ahead and use the E-wrap cast on method. You just do this by E-wrapping around each peg twice. If you want to see how to knit a more basic hat, if you're not familiar with E-wrapping, there's a link in the description box that will give you more detailed instructions. For the second row, I'm going to do a purl stitch all the way around the loom on each peg. Once again, if you're not sure how to do a purl stitch, there's going to be a link in the description box. It's fairly simple. You have your working yarn below the peg. As you see here, you pick up your loop, pull it through the working yarn, and then put that new loop back on the peg. I'll show you that again. Working yarn goes through the loop, and then put the new loop on the peg. And then I'm just continuing this on the all the way around the loom. Once again, if you do need more help with this section, I do have a video just showing you how to do the purl stitch, and I'm going to link that in the description. For the third row, I'm going to do a knit stitch all the way around the loom using the E-wrap method. This is just like we did with the cast on, I'm just doing it for a row. You'll kind of pick up pretty soon that I'm doing the knit, purl pattern. So I'm knitting a row entirely, and then I'm purling a row entirely, and then I'm knitting a row entirely. It's just kind of to give the brim of the hat a cool look. For the fourth row, I'm going to do a purl stitch again. Once again, this is all the way around the loom on each peg, and I'm just going to go ahead and continue it here. Okay. Now we're getting to the part of the video that actually shows you how to use the tiny heart stitch. I do have a full tutorial on this linked below. So to do this stitch, you're going to take your loop on your peg, pull it over and then under your working yarn, forming a loop, and then you're going to take this loop and put it over your peg, and then you're going to tighten that by pulling on the working yarn. To repeat this process, make sure your working yarn is above your loop, pick up your loop with your hook and pull it through the working yarn, which would form a loop, and then pull that loop on the peg and pull. You're going to repeat this process all the way around the loom on each peg. This is kind of a difficult stitch to describe verbally because there's so many components, so I'm just going to keep showing you again and again of me doing it. If this is still too complicated for you to pick up, I do have a short video that I will link below that literally shows you step by step how to do this stitch. So check that out below if you're having issues. Once again, I'm just continuing this stitch all the way around the loom on each peg. I'm going to pick up my loop with my hook, pull it over and through my working yarn, forming a loop, and then putting that loop on the peg and then tightening with the working yarn. And that's what it looks like so far. You can see that the tiny heart stitch leaves a little bit of a different loop behind than like a purl stitch or a knit stitch. So because of this, you're going to see in the tutorial, instead of doing row after row of the tiny heart stitch, I'm going to be mixing up a row of tiny heart stitch with 2 rows of knitting and then back to tiny heart stitch, just so to kind of keep the hat balanced and that we're not crowding the stitch too much. And once again, this is what that row of the tiny heart stitch looks like. For row number 6, I'm going to be doing a knit stitch by E-wrapping all the way around the loom. For row 7, I'm just going to be doing a tiny heart stitch. Now I'm going to do something a little bit different and incorporate a different strand color yarn as I do the row 8, which is a knit stitch. This is completely optional. I just like a little bit of color variety in the hat, and it allows the tiny heart stitch to kind of pop out a little bit more because you have the contrast of the white yarn. So I just wrapped white yarn around my central knob, and then I'm just taking this white yarn and doing an E-wrap all the way around for a knit stitch. And I'll just kind of explain row by row if I incorporate the white yarn or the blue yarn. It's just kind of a way to add contrast. If this is the first time that you're using this stitch, I would not recommend doing it. It's just kind of an added bonus that can give your hat a little bit more flair. For row 9, I'm going to be doing another knit stitch. Once again, this is with the white yarn. It's just to help spread that tiny heart stitch a little bit more. For row 10, I'm going to be doing another knit stitch. Continuing with the white yarn again, this is going to be my final row of the E-wrap knit stitch. For row 11, I'm going to be doing that tiny heart stitch again. This time I'm going to be using the blue yarn. So it's actually kind of easier to see what I'm doing here because I have a color contrast between the yarn that is already on the loom and then my working yarn. So once again for this stitch, you can just see I'm taking that loop, pulling it over and through the working yarn, forming a loop, and then taking that loop and putting it over the peg and then creating tension. And I'm just continuing this all the way around the loom on each peg. You could mix it up a little bit and only do the tiny heart stitch on every other peg or every 3 pegs if you want it to be a little bit more spread throughout the hat, but just for this pattern I chose to do it on every peg. For row 12, I'm going to be doing another knit stitch. This time I'm going to be working with the white yarn. So even though I use the blue yarn for the row 11 with the tiny heart stitch, for this row with row 12 I'm going to be using the white yarn again because it's a knit stitch. For row 13, I'm going to be doing another knit stitch row, once again using the white yarn, just continuing around the loom. Once again, you can kind of notice the pattern I'm doing here. 1 row of the tiny heart stitch using the blue yarn, and then 2 rows of doing an E-wrap knit stitch all the way around the loom using white yarn. So just kind of keep that in mind. I'm keeping with the same pattern, I'm just showing it to you again and again so you get the idea. Once again, here's the detailed version of the pattern. I did a total of 24 rows for this hat, so that just shows you the breakdown of row 14, 15, 16, 17, and on. And then to take this hat off the loom, I'm just going to pull some yarn here and cut it off. I just want to leave about 16-inch tail of white yarn so that I can add a pom-pom on later, but that's also optional. I'm going to cut my blue yarn here because I'm not going to be working with that anymore, and then I'm just going to tie the blue yarn off in a knot. With the white yarn, I'm just going to take my hook and then pull it through each loop that I have on the loom, and then I'm going to take that loop off of the loom. It's just a method of casting off. I use a hook here. Some people use a needle. It's kind of personal preference. Hopefully if you've done a hat before, you know how to do this. If not, I will link below the tutorial that shows you just how to knit a hat, not using any kind of fancy stitches or colors or anything, just a simple hat if you need a little bit of a refresher on that. So I'm just going to continue to cast off all the way around the loom. And here I'm just taking off that last peg, pulling my working yarn through and taking the hat off of the loom. After I pull that last peg through, I'm just going to tie a little knot at the base of the hat. And that's what the actual hat looks like. You can kind of see that contrast between the tiny heart stitch and then the 2 rows of the knit stitch. So here I have two hats side by side, one that I did with the alternating color pattern, and then one that I chose to not do. So you can see here I did that style of the tiny heart stitch, then the 2 rows of the knit stitch, and then with this one I just chose to do a tiny heart stitch and then a row of knit stitch, and then tiny. It's a little bit more crowded than the other one, and you can kind of see how that reflects in the pattern. Also, you notice how the color change can affect things. Thanks so much for watching, and happy knitting! I hope you enjoyed this tutorial.